The letter arrived on the coldest morning of the year, tucked between a heating oil bill and a pizza coupon, like it was just another piece of ordinary mail. It was not ordinary. Nothing from Sherry Ashford was ever ordinary. I remember pulling it out of my mailbox with my bare hands because I'd forgotten my gloves inside, and the metal flap of that mailbox was so cold it felt like it was trying to take a layer of skin with it. My breath was coming out in thick white clouds. The thermometer on my porch had read -14 degrees Fahrenheit that morning, which was the kind of cold that makes your nose hairs freeze the second you step outside. The kind of cold that makes your car engine groan and beg for mercy. The kind of cold that, honest to goodness, hurts your face when you walk into the wind. And there I was, Carl Russell, standing in my own driveway at 7 in the morning in a bathrobe and slippers, reading a formal letter from the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association informing me that my chimney was emitting what they described as an excessive and aesthetically inappropriate volume of smoke, in violation of HOA Regulation 14.7, subsection B, regarding visual pollution and air quality standards within the community. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. Then I stood there for a second and just stared at the street, where about 18 inches of snow had fallen over the past 2 days, and where the plows had pushed a wall of gray slush against every single car parked along the curb. My own driveway was a sheet of packed ice under a fresh dusting of powder. My neighbor Dave had his truck stuck half in and half out of his garage because the ice made it slide sideways when he tried to back out. The whole neighborhood looked like a frozen tundra, and the HOA was concerned about my chimney smoke. Let me back up a little bit so you have the full picture, because this story goes deeper than just one letter. I bought my house in Maplewood Ridge about 6 years ago. It's a nice house. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a good-sized yard. One of the things I absolutely loved about it was the fireplace. It's a proper wood-burning fireplace, built with real stone, big enough to heat most of the first floor if you feed it right. When I moved in, I had the chimney professionally inspected and cleaned, kept all the records, and I use it every winter. There's nothing like a real wood fire when it gets genuinely cold outside. I'm not talking about a decorative gas log situation. I mean actual split hardwood, a good draft, the whole deal. It heats the living room and the kitchen area beautifully, and during a deep cold snap it takes a serious load off my furnace. Now the HOA. Maplewood Ridge HOA had always been a little annoying, the way most HOAs are. There were rules about trash cans and about the color you could paint your shutters and about how tall your grass could get. Normal suburban stuff, mostly ignorable. The board changed over a little bit every year, and for the first few years I was there, the HOA was more of a nuisance than an actual problem. Then Sherry Ashford got elected to the board. Sherry lived 2 streets over, in a house that had a perfectly manicured lawn in the summer, and always had the exact right number of seasonal decorations out front at every holiday. She was maybe 55, drove a white luxury SUV that she somehow kept gleaming clean even in the middle of winter, and she had a talent for making every interaction feel like a performance. She wasn't just on the board. Within about 18 months of joining, she had maneuvered herself into the position of HOA president, and she ran it like it was her personal fiefdom. I'd had one prior run-in with Sherry before this chimney incident. About a year and a half earlier, she'd sent me a notice about my mailbox post being slightly off vertical. I'd been meaning to fix it, but it was a small lean, barely noticeable, and I had other things going on. She sent the notice, and then she sent a follow-up, and then she sent what I can only describe as a thinly veiled threat letter about fines. I straightened the post that weekend, and that was the end of it, but it established something. She had me on her radar. What I found out later, from my neighbor Donna, who was also on the board, was that Sherry kept a literal binder on every resident she had a complaint about. She'd drive around the neighborhood doing what she called community compliance reviews, which was a fancy way of saying she drove around looking for things to write people up for. She had photos. She had dates. She had printed out copies of the HOA rules with relevant passages highlighted, and she had a particular dislike for what she called visual disruption, which apparently included things like visible smoke coming from chimneys. Now, here's what I want to be very clear about. My chimney was absolutely, provably legal. Wood-burning fireplaces were explicitly permitted under the HOA rules as long as you weren't burning trash or treated wood or anything that would produce toxic smoke. I was burning clean, properly seasoned hardwood, split by a local guy named Hector who sold cords every fall out of his property a few miles away. Good dry oak and hickory, stacked neatly under a tarp on the side of my house. Nothing exotic, nothing problematic. But Regulation 14.7, subsection B was a newer addition to the rules. Sherry had pushed it through at a board meeting about 2 years prior, a meeting that only 7 people attended because it was in the middle of a football Sunday. The regulation was vague enough to be dangerous. It said something about residents being responsible for ensuring that visible emissions from their property did not materially detract from the visual quality of the neighborhood. It didn't define materially detract. It didn't specify a smoke opacity level or a cubic foot per minute threshold or anything measurable. It was just a vague, deliberately slippery regulation that could mean whatever Sherry wanted it to mean. And now she wanted it to mean that I couldn't run my fireplace in -14 degrees. I went back inside, poured a cup of coffee, and read the letter more carefully at my kitchen table. The fire was burning beautifully, I'll tell you that. The warmth coming off it was incredible. Outside, the wind was picking up and spitting snow against the window. My furnace had actually been struggling a little because when it gets that cold, the heat just bleeds out of the walls and the furnace runs almost continuously trying to keep up. The fireplace was genuinely helping. The letter informed me that I had 10 days to cease the emission, or I would face fines of $50 per day, compounding, until the violation was resolved. It also mentioned, in that particularly infuriating bureaucratic passive voice, that continued noncompliance may result in escalating enforcement measures. It was signed by Sherry Ashford, HOA president, in a very neat, very deliberate signature. I set the letter down and I did something smart. I took a picture of it with my phone. Then I started a folder on my laptop called Ashford HOA File, and I scanned the letter and put it in there, because I had a feeling this wasn't going to be a quick thing. The next morning the temperature had dropped even further. -19. The local news was calling it a historic cold snap. Schools were closed. Half the businesses in town were running on skeleton crews. My pipes in the garage had actually frozen overnight, which meant I was hauling a space heater out there to thaw them. A state of emergency had been declared at the county level. The governor had made a statement urging people to conserve heat and avoid unnecessary travel. I fired up the wood burner early that morning and let it run all day. By noon, I had another letter in my mailbox. Same format, same regulations cited. This time the language was sharper. This is a second formal notice. It mentioned the fine schedule again. It mentioned the potential for further action. 2 letters in 2 days, in a state of emergency, for running a wood-burning fireplace during a historic cold snap. I walked over to my neighbor Dave's house, because Dave had been dealing with his own issues with Sherry, and I needed someone to talk to who would understand the level of absurdity. Dave answered the door in a heavy flannel shirt, holding a mug of something hot. His garage had a new piece of equipment visible behind him, some kind of industrial heat gun he'd bought to deal with his frozen lock situation. I showed him the letters. He read both of them, and then he made a face that can only be described as a man trying very hard not to say a word he'd regret. "Carl," he said, "she sent Terry Nguyen a letter last August because his welcome mat was the wrong shade of beige." "I know," I said. "She fined the Hendersons because their recycling bin was 6 inches past the property line on collection day." "I know. And now she's trying to tell you not to heat your house during a polar vortex. That's what it says. We stood there for a minute. Then Dave said something that turned out to be excellent advice. He said, "Carl, I think you need to go back and read the HOA rules very carefully. Not just the part she's citing, all of it." I went home and I did exactly that. The HOA rule document was 38 pages long, which is about 38 pages longer than it needed to be for a neighborhood of 92 houses. I printed the whole thing out, made a pot of fresh coffee, sat down in front of the fireplace and read it word by word. Regulation 14.7, subsection B was indeed in there. But here's what I also found. Section 3.1, titled Emergency Provisions, contained a clause that stated explicitly that HOA regulations regarding cosmetic and aesthetic matters were suspended and unenforceable during any declared state of emergency, natural disaster, or condition classified as a public safety hazard by any state, county, or municipal authority. Furthermore, Section 22, which was buried near the back in a section called General Interpretation Provisions, stated that no HOA regulation could be construed to require a homeowner to take any action or refrain from any action when such action or inaction would constitute a threat to the health, safety, or welfare of persons residing in the property. The governor had declared a state of emergency. The county had seconded it. The local municipality had issued its own safety advisory. -19 degrees was, by any reasonable definition, a public safety hazard. And requiring me to shut down my fireplace in those conditions was arguably requiring me to take an action that constituted a threat to my own health and safety, especially given that my furnace was already straining to keep up. Sherry's Regulation 14.7, subsection B, which she'd snuck through a poorly attended meeting on a football Sunday, was completely unenforceable under the HOA's own document. I wrote that down. Then I wrote it down again more clearly, with the section numbers and the page numbers and the exact text. I highlighted the relevant passages in my printed copy. I was not going to fire off an emotional response. I was going to do this correctly. That afternoon, I called a real estate attorney I knew named Phil Garza. Phil handled a lot of HOA disputes in the area, and I'd met him through a mutual friend at a cookout a couple of summers ago. I explained the situation. Phil said, "Carl, that emergency provisions clause is a gift. They can't touch you under that alone. But beyond that, their regulation as written is so vague it wouldn't survive a legal challenge anyway. Materially detract from visual quality is not a measurable standard. Any judge worth their robe would throw that out." Phil offered to send a formal attorney letter on my behalf if it came to that. I thanked him, saved his number in a more prominent spot on my phone, and went back to my fireplace. The fire was burning clean and steady. I'd added a couple of good-sized logs, and the living room was genuinely warm and comfortable. Outside, the snow was still falling in small, hard pellets driven sideways by the wind. The street was completely empty. Nobody was going anywhere. Over the next 2 days, the cold snap intensified. -22 degrees became the new overnight low. The local utility company issued a gas pressure advisory, asking people to reduce their thermostat settings to help maintain pressure in the system, because demand was so high that some neighborhoods were seeing drops in pressure. On the news, they were reporting cases of pipes bursting across the county and one apartment complex where the boiler had failed, and dozens of residents had to be temporarily relocated to a warming center at the local high school. I kept my fireplace going. I reduced my thermostat to 65 as the utility asked and let the wood fire handle the rest. My house was comfortable. My pipes were fine. 3 more letters arrived over those 2 days, all from Sherry. The third letter added a new element. It claimed that a resident had formally complained about my chimney smoke, causing respiratory distress, and that this elevated the matter to a health complaint. The fourth letter stated that my cumulative fines now totaled $150 and were growing daily. The fifth letter, which arrived on the second afternoon, was the most aggressive yet. It stated that if I did not immediately and permanently cease operation of the wood-burning apparatus, the HOA would pursue a legal injunction to enforce compliance. 5 letters in 4 days, during a historic cold snap, about my fireplace. Now, here's where things took a genuine turn, because Sherry made a mistake. A real, actual mistake that crossed from annoying abuse of HOA authority into something legally significant. I found out about it from Donna, my neighbor who sat on the HOA board. Donna called me on the evening of the second day of letters, and she sounded nervous and a little bit excited at the same time. She told me that Sherry had, without a board vote, unilaterally contacted a local code enforcement officer and filed a formal nuisance complaint against my property. Not an HOA complaint, a municipal code complaint. She'd submitted it under the residential air quality section of the municipal code, claiming my fireplace was creating a health hazard. Here's why that was a mistake. The HOA president did not have the unilateral authority to file municipal complaints on behalf of the HOA. Under the HOA's own bylaws, any formal legal action or government filing required a majority board vote. Sherry had bypassed the board entirely. She'd also, according to Donna, misrepresented herself in the complaint filing, describing herself as filing on behalf of the HOA board when no such vote had occurred. That was a false statement to a municipal authority, which is, depending on how you look at it, a form of fraud. Donna had screenshots of the board's internal message thread where Sherry had announced she was filing the complaint without asking anyone. Several board members had responded with objections. Sherry had dismissed them all. Donna sent me the screenshots. I forwarded everything to Phil Garza. Phil's response, about an hour later, was a voice message that I could actually hear him smiling through. He said the misrepresentation to a municipal authority was significant. He said we should put together a complete package, the letters, the screenshots, the timeline, the board vote records showing no vote was taken, and present it all at once. He said the approach should be methodical and devastating, his exact word, devastating, and that we should time it for maximum effect. We decided to bring it to the next HOA board meeting, which was scheduled for 10 days out. That gave me time to prepare, gave Phil time to draft a formal response letter, and gave Donna time to quietly reach out to the other board members who were already uncomfortable with what Sherry was doing. In the meantime, I did a few things. I documented everything. Every morning I took a photo of my outdoor thermometer, with the date and time visible on my phone screen. I photographed the wood pile, showing clean, properly seasoned hardwood. I photographed my fireplace with a burning fire and put a digital thermometer reading visible in the frame to show the ambient outside temperature. I kept a daily log in a simple document. Day 1, -22 degrees, fire burning, letter received. Day 2, -19 degrees, fire burning, 2 letters received, and so on. I also did something that turned out to be very satisfying later. I went back and checked all of my original fireplace paperwork. I had the inspection report from when I bought the house. I had the annual cleaning receipts, and I also had something I hadn't thought about in a while but turned out to be gold. When I'd had the fireplace cleaned 2 autumns ago, the chimney sweep had filled out a standard form that included a section on smoke opacity and draft quality. The form rated both as excellent and included a note that the fireplace was operating at optimal efficiency with no indications of incomplete combustion. Optimal efficiency. No incomplete combustion. Documented, dated, signed by a licensed chimney professional. Incomplete combustion, for anyone who doesn't know, is what causes heavy, dirty, dark smoke. When wood burns completely and the draft is good, the smoke is light and relatively thin. It's mostly water vapor and a small amount of particulate matter. You can't eliminate it entirely, but it's nothing like the thick black smoke you'd get from burning wet wood or trash. My fireplace was documented as running clean. Whatever Sherry was complaining about was either a misunderstanding of how wood fire works, or it was deliberately manufactured outrage. I started to suspect it was the latter. Dave, to his eternal credit, mentioned offhandedly one day that his security camera at the front of his house actually had an angle that included part of my front yard and my chimney stack. He'd installed the camera a few months back after someone had gone through several cars on the street overnight. He checked the footage from the days in question, and this was genuinely funny. The footage clearly showed my chimney producing normal, light, thin smoke that dissipated quickly in the wind. There was nothing unusual about it. More importantly, the footage also caught Sherry's white SUV rolling slowly past my house twice on both of the days she sent letters. Once in the morning, once in the afternoon. She was driving by and watching and documenting. In negative 20-degree weather. Dave saved all of that footage and sent me copies. The days ticked by. The cold snap broke, as cold snaps eventually do after about a week of brutal temperatures. The temperature crept back up to the low 20s, then the upper 20s. Then one morning I woke up and it was 38 degrees, which felt positively tropical by comparison. Half the neighborhood came outside like bears emerging from hibernation. People were shoveling their walks, digging out cars, checking their pipes for damage. Dave and I spent an afternoon clearing the ice buildup that had formed behind his retaining wall before it could heave the stones. The letters from Sherry had stopped after the fifth one. I think even she understood that the optics of continuing to find someone for heating their house during a negative 20-degree state of emergency cold snap were not great, but the fines were still accumulating on paper. She'd set the mechanism in motion and it was still running. My documented total owed, according to the HOA's own tally, which Donna quietly got a copy of for me, was now $350. $50 a day for 7 days. That was the amount Sherry intended to present at the board meeting and demand I pay. Phil Garza sent the formal attorney letter to the HOA about 5 days before the board meeting. It was polite, thorough, and absolutely airtight. It cited Section 3.1 and the emergency suspension clause. It cited Section 22 and the health and safety provision. It noted that the state emergency declaration, the county emergency declaration, and the municipal safety advisory were all on record and all applicable. It noted that Regulation 14.7 subsection B was, as written, an unenforceable vague standard that could not withstand legal scrutiny. And then, at the end, almost as an afterthought, it noted that the HOA's filing of a municipal code complaint without a board vote, misrepresenting the board's authorization, appeared to constitute a violation of both the HOA's own bylaws and potentially applicable statutes regarding false statements to governmental bodies. Phil sent its certified mail and regular mail simultaneously, addressed to the HOA board collectively, with individual copies for each board member by name, including Sherry. He also sent a digital copy to the HOA's management company, which handled their administrative functions. I heard from Donna that Sherry received her copy, brought it to the next informal board call that Phil had not been invited to, and announced that it was frivolous harassment from a homeowner who clearly doesn't respect community standards. 2 of the other 4 board members told her, on that call, that they thought they needed to take this seriously. A third one said he was going to consult his own attorney before the meeting. That was 3 out of 5 board members expressing reservations, which meant Sherry was isolated. The board meeting was held on a Tuesday evening at the community clubhouse, which was a small building at the end of the main road that primarily got used for meetings and the occasional block party planning session. It was heated, thankfully, because we were still getting cold spells, nothing as extreme as the previous week, but still cold enough that you wanted a coat. I got there early and set up at the front of the room at the homeowner's table, which was a folding table facing the board's table. I had a folder with me, printed copies of everything, the letters, the rule document with highlighted sections, Phil's letter, the chimney inspection report, my daily temperature and fire log with photos, the Dave's camera footage screenshots with timestamps, the screenshots from the board message thread showing Sherry had filed the municipal complaint without a vote. Dave came with me. So did Donna, who was at the board table in her official capacity. 3 other neighbors also showed up, which was not something that usually happened at these meetings. Normally, these meetings got maybe 5 or 6 people. This one had about 20 residents because word had gotten around. In a neighborhood, word always gets around. Sherry arrived looking very put together. She had a blazer on over a turtleneck sweater, her hair was perfect, and she was carrying her own folder that was, I noticed, quite thick. She sat down at the board table, arranged her materials, and scanned the room with a look that shifted from confident to slightly less confident when she saw how many people were there. The meeting was called to order. There were a few routine items first: road maintenance discussion, a vote on whether to extend the landscaping contract, that kind of thing. Then Sherry moved to open the enforcement agenda. The board chair, a quiet man named Robert, acknowledged her. Sherry began explaining the situation with what she clearly thought was calm authority. She said that I had been in violation of Regulation 14.7 subsection B for 7 consecutive days, that the fines were documented, and that she was requesting the board formally affirm the fine schedule and authorize collection. She said she had photographs and she produced them from her folder. They were printed photographs of my chimney, taken from the street with visible smoke. I let her finish. I let her lay everything out. Then Robert asked if I had anything to say. I opened my folder. I started with the Emergency Provisions Clause, Section 3.1. I read it aloud from the printed HOA document. Then I put the state emergency declaration on the table, then the county one. Then the municipal safety advisory. I showed the dates. I showed the overlap with the dates on Sherry's letters and the dates of the alleged violation. I pointed out, very calmly, that under the HOA's own rules, Section 3.1 explicitly suspended aesthetic and cosmetic regulations during declared emergencies. I asked Robert if it was the board's position that this clause did not apply. There was a silence. Robert looked at the document I'd placed in front of him. He looked at the emergency declarations. He looked at Sherry. Sherry said the emergency provision was intended for structural damage and utility failures, not cosmetic complaints. She said it had to be read in context. I then read Section 22. No HOA regulation may be construed to require a homeowner to take any action or refrain from any action when such action or inaction would constitute a threat to the health, safety, or welfare of persons residing in the property. I put the thermometer photos on the table. -14, -19, -22. I showed the utility company's own advisory asking residents to reduce thermostat settings, which I pointed out actually encouraged the use of supplemental heat sources like fireplaces. I said that running a fireplace in those conditions was not an aesthetic choice. It was a heating necessity that multiple governmental authorities had effectively endorsed. Then I put Phil Garza's attorney letter on the table and slid copies to each board member. Sherry looked at the letter. Her expression changed a little bit. Not a lot, but a little. I wasn't done. I put the chimney inspection report on the table. I showed the optimal efficiency rating and the no incomplete combustion note. I said that the smoke produced by my fireplace was consistent with normal, clean-burning wood fire operation and was documented as such by a licensed professional. Then I put Dave's security camera screenshots on the table. I said, these are time-stamped images from a neighbor's security camera showing my chimney on 3 of the 7 days Sherry cited in her violation letters. I'd like the board to look at these, and tell me if this looks like an excessive or inappropriate emission to them. The images showed thin, light smoke drifting away from a chimney stack. Completely normal. I also mentioned that the footage showed Sherry's vehicle passing by my house twice on 2 of those days. There was some murmuring among the attending residents. Then I got to the municipal complaint. I put the screenshots of the board message thread on the table, the one showing Sherry announcing she'd filed the complaint without asking anyone, and the responses from the other board members objecting. I said, I'd like to address the municipal code complaint that was filed against my property. According to the HOA's own bylaws, Section 9, Subsection 4, any formal legal action or governmental filing made on behalf of the HOA requires a majority vote of the board. The screenshots in front of you are from the HOA's own internal message thread, and they show that no such vote was taken. They show, in fact, that multiple board members objected when Sherry announced she was filing the complaint unilaterally, and they show that in the complaint itself, the filing was represented as being made on behalf of the HOA board, which was a false statement. The room was very quiet. Robert said slowly, Sherry, is this accurate? Sherry said, I was acting in the best interests of the community. Robert said, did you file a complaint with the municipal code office representing it as coming from the board without a board vote? Sherry said something about how it was a time-sensitive situation. Robert said, Sherry, please answer the question. She did not answer the question directly. She said something about how the process could be ratified retroactively, and that this was standard practice for urgent matters. 2 of the board members, the ones who had expressed reservations on the earlier call, said simultaneously that they had never heard of retroactive ratification being standard practice, and that this was not how they understood the bylaws to work. Phil Garza, who had come with me and had been sitting quietly in a chair against the wall, stood up and introduced himself. He said he had reviewed the municipal complaint filing and the HOA bylaws, and that, in his professional opinion, the filing constituted a material misrepresentation to a governmental authority. He said there were several statutes under which that could constitute a criminal offense. He said he had already been in contact with the municipal code office and had put them on notice of the circumstances, and that he expected the complaint to be dismissed without action. He also said, and he was very calm and clear about this, that his client, meaning me, had not yet decided whether to pursue the matter further but was preserving all options. Sherry Ashford looked, for possibly the first time in her tenure as HOA president, like she was genuinely rattled. She tried one more angle. She said that the community had a right to maintain its standards and that one resident running a fireplace continuously for days was causing smoke that affected neighboring properties. She cited the resident who had complained of respiratory distress. I had actually expected her to do this. I'd done some digging. I said, could the board tell me which resident filed a formal health complaint? Because if there was a genuine health concern, I want to take that seriously. I paused. I ask because I spoke with every neighbor within a direct downwind line from my chimney, and none of them had any complaints. I have written statements from 6 of them here. I produced the statements. My neighbor Barbara, who had mild asthma and whose house was directly downwind, had specifically written that she had not noticed any unusual smoke or air quality issues and had no complaints about my fireplace. Robert asked Sherry, who had filed the health complaint. Sherry said it was submitted anonymously. Robert said, we received an anonymous health complaint. Sherry said, the person wished to remain anonymous. There was another long pause. Dave from the back of the room said, fairly quietly but not quietly enough, that's convenient. I said, I want to be very clear. If there is a genuine anonymous resident who experienced genuine respiratory distress, I would be happy to discuss it directly and make reasonable accommodations. But an anonymous, unverifiable complaint cannot form the legal basis for a fining action, particularly against a background of documented emergency conditions, documented appropriate fireplace operation, and the emergency suspension provisions in the HOA's own rules. Robert looked at the other board members. He called for a brief recess. During the recess, I could see through the window in the door that Robert and the other two skeptical board members were having a very animated conversation. Sherry was not part of it. She was sitting at the table looking at her phone with an expression that was working very hard to look unconcerned and not quite getting there. When the meeting resumed, Robert announced that the board had determined, based on the provisions of Sections 3.1 and 22 of the HOA rules, and the documented state of emergency in effect during the cited period, that the fines levied against me under Regulation 14.7 subsection B were void and unenforceable. He said the fines were being dismissed in their entirety. He also said that the board would be reviewing Regulation 14.7 subsection B for potential revision, given its apparent vagueness and the questions that had been raised about it. Then he said, and this was the part the whole room was waiting for, that the board took the question of unauthorized municipal filings very seriously, and that the board was placing a formal motion on the agenda for the next meeting to investigate the circumstances of the filing. He said pending that investigation, he was recommending that the board temporarily transfer signature authority for any external filings from the president to a dual signature requirement involving any two board members. He called for a vote on dismissing the fines, 4-1 in favor. Sherry voted against, of course. He called for the vote on the dual signature requirement, 4-1, same result. The meeting ended. People started gathering their things. Several neighbors came over to shake my hand or clap me on the shoulder. Old Mr. Peterson from the corner house, who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years and had been getting HOA letters about his fence for the past 2 of them, came over and said, "Carl, that was the best HOA meeting I have ever attended, and I've been to a lot of bad ones." His wife nodded enthusiastically behind him. Sherry left without speaking to anyone. Outside in the parking lot, Phil and I talked for a few minutes. He said that the board's actions were appropriate and that the dual signature requirement was a sensible safeguard. He said the question of the false municipal filing was still open and that I should think about whether I wanted to pursue it formally. He said, "You've got the evidence. The question is what you want to do with it." I told him I wanted to sleep on it. I drove home. My house was warm. I lit a small fire in the fireplace more out of habit than necessity, because the temperature outside had climbed back to a relatively reasonable 28 degrees. I sat in front of it with a beer and thought about the whole thing. The thing about situations like this, with HOA power plays, is that there's always a temptation to just declare victory and move on. The fines were gone. The regulation was being reviewed. Sherry's authority had been publicly limited. That was a lot. I had clearly won the immediate fight, but I kept coming back to the municipal filing, because that wasn't just an HOA overreach. That was a false statement to a government office. That was using an official channel to try to generate real legal pressure against me based on a misrepresentation. That was a step beyond sending me annoying letters. I called Phil the next morning and told him I wanted to move forward with a formal complaint. Phil filed a complaint with the county attorney's office, which handled cases involving false statements to municipal bodies. He submitted everything: the screenshots, the HOA bylaws, the complaint filing, the board meeting record showing no vote was taken, a written statement from each of the 4 board members, including Donna, confirming they had not authorized the filing and had not been consulted. The county attorney's office looked at it and about 3 weeks later invited Sherry to come in for what they called an informational interview. Sherry went with her own attorney. The interview, from what I later pieced together through the public records, apparently did not go very well for her. The county attorney's office found sufficient basis to refer the matter to the district attorney's office for a determination on whether to file charges. While that process was working itself out, the HOA board moved forward with their internal investigation. They hired an independent HOA management consultant to review the board's actions over the past 2 years under Sherry's presidency. The consultant's report, which became available to homeowners on request, was not flattering. It documented 17 instances where Sherry had taken actions that required board votes without obtaining them. It documented a pattern of selective enforcement where residents who had openly disagreed with Sherry at meetings subsequently received disproportionate numbers of violation notices. It documented the use of HOA funds to pay for professional printing services for what appeared to be personally drafted correspondence, which raised a separate question about the appropriate use of HOA resources. The board voted 5-0 to remove Sherry from the presidency. Donna told me later that Sherry had resigned just before the vote to save face, but the vote happened anyway and was recorded unanimously in the minutes. The district attorney's office, after reviewing the county attorney's referral, chose to charge Sherry with 1 count of filing a false statement with a governmental body. It was a misdemeanor charge, not a felony, but it was a real charge with real consequences. I am not going to sit here and pretend I felt bad about that, because I don't think I would be telling the truth if I did. She had deliberately used the machinery of government to try to bully me out of heating my house in conditions that could genuinely have caused harm if I'd complied. The case resolved about 4 months later with a guilty plea. Sherry received a small fine and a period of probation, and the terms included that she could not hold any position of authority in any HOA or similar governing body for 5 years. Her attorney had negotiated the charge down from the original, and the sentence was on the lighter end, but the plea and the conviction were real and public record. The local neighborhood Facebook group, which had about 80% of the residents in it, was very busy the week that news got around. I didn't post about it myself. I didn't need to. Donna posted the board's official statement, which was factual and not particularly dramatic, and the comment section did the rest of the work. Several things changed in Maplewood Ridge after that. The HOA revised Regulation 14.7 subsection B almost immediately. The new version specified that wood-burning fireplaces were explicitly permitted, that only genuine nuisance smoke situations involving clearly abnormal emissions, such as burning of prohibited materials, could be cited, and that any citation had to include documented evidence of a measurable violation, not just a subjective complaint. The vague, visual quality language was removed entirely. Phil reviewed the new version and told me it was actually quite sensible. A new board president was elected, a guy named Marcus who lived on the east end of the neighborhood and ran a small business. Marcus had about as much interest in power plays as I had in receiving HOA letters. His main goals, as he stated publicly, were keeping the common areas maintained and keeping the fee increases reasonable. In his first 6 months in office, he handled approximately 0 disputes, and the neighborhood was significantly more pleasant. The HOA also, quietly and without much fanfare, adopted a new rule that all board meetings had to be recorded, and that recordings had to be made available to residents who requested them within 2 weeks. That was partly inspired by the whole episode and partly inspired by a motion from 3 board members who had clearly been wanting some accountability for a while. Dave and I celebrated by having a proper winter cookout on my back deck the next Saturday, which is a slightly unhinged thing to do when it's 31 degrees outside, but we were in the mood for it. Burgers on a charcoal grill while wearing winter coats. His wife thought we were ridiculous. My girlfriend thought we were ridiculous. We thought we were having a great time. The chimney was going too, because why not? A few months later, one of the neighbors who I hadn't known very well before all this, a woman named Pat from 3 doors down, stopped me on the sidewalk one evening. She said she'd been getting letters about her garden shed for about 1.5 years and that she'd been stressed about it and hadn't known what to do. She said watching what happened at that board meeting had made her realize she had rights too, and that she'd reread the rules and found a similar situation to mine, where the specific regulation being cited had exceptions that applied to her case. She'd written a simple letter citing the relevant sections, and the new board had dropped the matter immediately. She said, "I just wanted to say thank you." She said it had cost her a lot of anxiety over a shed. That stuck with me more than pretty much anything else in the whole ordeal. What I learned from all of this, the thing that actually matters, is that the power that an HOA has over you is almost entirely conditional on you not knowing what you're actually dealing with. Sherry's whole operation depended on residents being intimidated by formal letters, by the accumulation of paper and legal-sounding language, by the implied threat of escalation. The moment you sit down and actually read the rules and understand them better than the person wielding them against you, the whole thing changes. She had the binder and the blazer and the perfectly timed formal letters, but I had the actual document that the HOA operated under, a basic understanding of how to read it, and a phone number for an attorney. The fireplace, by the way, has been running every winter since. Clean, seasoned hardwood, good draft, the whole setup. Nobody has ever said another word about it. The chimney does what chimneys do, which is release a thin column of smoke into the cold air, and the neighbors either don't notice or don't care, because the neighbors are reasonable human beings who understand how fireplaces work. Last December, during a cold snap that wasn't quite as extreme as the famous one but was still pretty brutal, maybe -8 degrees, I was stacking a fresh load of wood that Hector had just dropped off. Dave came over to help because that's just what you do. We were stacking the wood in the side yard, under the tarp overhang I'd built to keep it dry. And Dave said, completely out of nowhere, "You know what's been noticeably absent from your mailbox this winter?" I said, "I do know." He said, "No letters about your chimney." I said, "None at all." He thought about that for a second and then he picked up another armload of wood and said, "Good." And it genuinely was. The street looked beautiful in the winter cold, honestly. The snow was fresh and white and hadn't been plowed into gray slush yet. The houses had their lights on, warm glows in the windows, smoke coming from a couple of chimneys including mine. The neighborhood looked like a neighborhood, like people actually lived there, and actually used their homes for the purpose they were designed for, which is shelter and warmth and a place to belong. I thought about Sherry briefly, in the way you sometimes think about a difficult thing that happened and then resolved cleanly. She'd moved out of Maplewood Ridge about 8 months after the HOA situation, sold her house and relocated somewhere else. I don't know where she went. I hope she's doing okay in a general sense, the way you hope that about a person. But I will tell you honestly that I also hope, wherever she is, she's not on an HOA board. Because some people find something about the mixture of authority and rules and the ability to send formal letters on official stationery, and they just can't help themselves. It does something to them. And a neighborhood is supposed to be a place where people can run their fireplace in -20 weather without getting 5 letters about it. I closed the tarp over the fresh stack of wood, checked the knots, and went inside. The fire was going strong. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke in that distant background way, just the edge of it, pleasant and warm and entirely legal. I put a pot of chili on the stove because it was that kind of afternoon. Dave stayed for dinner. His wife came over. My girlfriend came home from work and stopped in the doorway still in her coat and said, "It smells so good in here." I said, "Fireplace." She said, "Don't ever let anyone take that away from you." I said, "I didn't." She said, "I know." That's what I like about you, Carl. And that was enough. That was genuinely enough. Outside, the snow was coming down again, steady and soft, covering the street in a fresh layer of quiet white. The fire cracked and settled behind the screen. The chili bubbled on the stove. And Maplewood Ridge was, for the first time in a couple of years, a pretty decent place to live. The HOA's January newsletter, under Marcus's new leadership, was 3 pages long instead of the usual 12. It covered the common area maintenance schedule, a reminder about the annual fee due date, and a note about a neighborhood winter potluck being organized for the following Saturday at the clubhouse. There was nothing about violations. There was nothing about fines. There was a small section that said, "We are a community of neighbors, and our goal is to help the neighborhood function well for everyone who lives here. Please reach out to the board if you have concerns." I read it at the same kitchen table where I'd read Sherry's letters, with the same fireplace burning behind me. I put it in the recycling bin, which was within the property line, and went about my day. Some stories end with a bang. This one ended with a warm house and a functioning community, and a chimney doing exactly what it was supposed to do. That's the kind of ending I'll take every time.